My name is Jack, and I run a commercial cleaning company called Apex Facilities Management. We handle contracts for office buildings, medical facilities, and corporate campuses across Ohio and parts of Indiana. Nothing flashy, no Silicon Valley energy, just a solid business my grandfather started back in 1978. He was a janitor at a Cleveland high school for 30 years, saving every dollar he could. One day he decided he was done making money for someone else. He started with 3 men, 1 van, and a whole lot of hustle. By the time my father took over, it was a real company. 50 employees, commercial contracts, the works. My dad doubled it, then tripled it. He turned Apex into the kind of operation where Fortune 500 companies trusted us to keep their facilities spotless. I grew up watching my father negotiate contracts with executives who looked down on him because he cleaned their buildings. He'd shake their hands, smile, take their money, and build something they could never take away. He taught me that the people who underestimate you are the ones you beat every time. Here's the thing about owning a service business. Nobody thinks you're wealthy. Nobody thinks you're impressive. When you tell someone at a party that you're in commercial cleaning, they picture a guy pushing a mop. That's fine. I've pushed plenty of mops. I started at 14, working summers for my dad. There's nothing wrong with honest work. But Apex has 140 employees, contracts worth $12 million a year, and I take home a comfortable 7 figures after expenses. I drive a 10-year-old pickup truck because I like it. I live in a modest house because I grew up in one. I dress like a normal guy because that's exactly what I am. My girlfriend, Brittany, never quite understood any of that. We met 3 years ago at a friend's backyard barbecue. She was 28, working as an administrative coordinator at a property management firm, and she seemed genuinely down to earth, the kind of person who actually listens when you talk. Looking back, that was probably the performance. The early months were good. Casual dinners, movies, weekend games at my place. Nothing fancy, nothing expensive. Brittany talked about wanting to build her career, find stability, meet someone who had his life together. She never pushed for expensive dates or lavish gifts. She never mentioned wanting someone to bankroll her lifestyle. At least, that's what I thought at the time. Looking back, I think she was running a longer game, testing me the same way I was testing her. She was just better at hiding it. About 8 months in, she mentioned she was unhappy at her job. Low pay, difficult boss, no room to grow. I made a decision that seemed reasonable at the time. I offered her a position at Apex. Now, here's something important about how my company is structured. I don't work out of the main office. I never have. My father set it up this way, and I kept the tradition. The main office is downtown and handles all the administration and client coordination. I work out of a small satellite office about 20 minutes away. Quiet, private. Keeps me separated from the daily noise. Most of the main office employees have never met me in person. They know the owner exists, they see my signature on their paychecks, but the face they associate with leadership is my general manager, a man named Warren, who's been running operations since before I took over. Warren reports directly to me. To everyone else, he's the boss. That's exactly how I want it. So when Brittany came to work at Apex, she had no idea I owned the place. I'd told her I worked in vendor management for a mid-sized business, which was technically true. I manage vendors. I also manage everything else. It was deceptive, maybe, but I'd been burned before. Women who suddenly became a lot more interested once they found out my financial situation. I wanted to see who Brittany really was when she thought I was just an average guy with an average job. For a while, things were fine. She started as an administrative assistant in the scheduling department. Competent, not exceptional, but solid. Then, about a year and a half in, we hired a new regional director named Grant. Grant was 34. He came from a competitor with an MBA and 10 years in facilities management. Polished, eloquent, the kind of guy who knew how to work a room. I was skeptical from day one. He had a smoothness that felt rehearsed, like he'd spent more time reading books about executive presence than actually doing the work. But Warren vouched for him, so I trusted the process. I met Grant exactly twice before things unraveled. Once during his final interview, where I posed as a consultant reviewing candidates for Warren. once at a company golf outing where I was introduced as a friend of Warren's who did some contract work. Grant had a habit of talking over people, interrupting mid-sentence to insert his own point, claiming credit for ideas that weren't his. Classic corporate climber. He had no idea who I was. Grant definitely noticed Brittany, though. The signs started small. She'd mentioned his name in conversation. Grant said this in today's meeting. Grant thinks the company should do that. Grant has such good ideas. At first, I didn't think much of it, but the mentions got more frequent and more personal. Grant has a great sense of humor. Grant told me about this restaurant he loves. Grant thinks I have real potential to move up in the company. I'm not an insecure person. People can admire their colleagues, but there was a tone in her voice when she talked about Grant, a kind of breathless admiration that felt familiar. It sounded like the way she used to talk about me. Then the other signs started stacking up. Phone face down at all times, carried it into the bathroom, tilted the screen away when she was texting. One night at dinner, it buzzed. She grabbed it fast, glanced at it, smiled, and turned it over without a word, said it was just work stuff. I didn't push. I noticed. She started working late more often. 2 nights a week, then 3, always vague about what projects needed so much extra time. She joined a gym out of nowhere, suddenly very interested in how she looked at the office. New clothes, new makeup, new motivation to get dressed up for work. Classic checklist of signs. I didn't say anything. I just watched. 3 months before everything came to a head, I quietly asked Warren to pull the security card access logs from the main office. I wanted to see when Grant was coming and going after hours and whether anyone else's card was being swiped around the same times. Warren came back 2 days later. Grant had been staying late 3 nights a week for the past 4 months. Brittany's card was being used 15 to 30 minutes after his. Then both cards would exit within minutes of each other, usually around 9 or 10 at night. I asked Warren if there was any legitimate work reason for that pattern. There wasn't. I sat with that information for a while. I could have confronted Brittany immediately. I could have fired Grant on the spot. But I'm not a dramatic person. I'm a strategic one. So I stayed quiet. I kept playing the clueless boyfriend with the boring job, going home every night to a woman who kissed me on the cheek while hiding an entire secret relationship. About 2 months before the end, Brittany started dropping hints about our finances. She suggested we should combine bank accounts since we'd been together 3 years, asked direct questions about my retirement savings, wondered aloud whether I was putting enough away for our future. The subtext was clear. She was trying to figure out exactly what I was worth, probably deciding whether to keep me as a backup plan while she pursued Grant. I gave her vague answers and watched. Then she asked me to come to the company Christmas party. I almost said no. The whole point of my setup was to stay invisible. But she pushed hard, said it would mean a lot, said she wanted to show me off. Against my better judgment, I agreed. The party was at a rented event space downtown, about 80 employees plus spouses and dates. Warren was there, Grant was there, and I was there in khakis and a button-down, just another face in the crowd. For the first hour, everything was fine. I made small talk, nobody recognized me. Brittany introduced me as her boyfriend, Jack, and kept the descriptions vague. Said I worked in vendor management, that I was reliable, that we'd been together 3 years. She never used words like ambitious or impressive, just reliable, steady, like a piece of furniture. Then Grant walked over. Expensive suit, designer watch. He shook my hand with that aggressive grip some guys use when they're trying to establish dominance. Then spent the next 20 minutes holding court about his vision for the company's expansion, his leadership philosophy, his plans to eventually move up to director of operations. Warren stood nearby with a perfectly neutral expression. We made eye contact once. I gave a subtle shake of my head. Not yet. At some point, Brittany drifted over and stood beside Grant. Not beside me, beside him. She looked up at him with an expression I recognized, the same admiration she used to aim at me.
Then Grant said the thing that changed everything. He was talking about leadership, about what separates the people who run things from the people who just follow orders. He turned to me with a condescending smile and said, "No offense, Jack, but some people are just built to lead. Others are better suited to support roles. Nothing wrong with being a good employee." Before I could respond, Brittany laughed. Not a polite laugh, a real one, like he'd said something both funny and true. Then she said it. "Grant's a real leader. Jack's just an employee, but he's reliable, like a golden retriever." The group laughed. I stood there for a moment. Expensive suit, designer watch. He shook my hand with that aggressive grip some guys use when they're trying to establish dominance. Then spent the next 20 minutes holding court about his vision for the company's expansion, his leadership philosophy, his plans to eventually move up to director of operations. Warren stood nearby with a perfectly neutral expression. We made eye contact once. I gave a subtle shake of my head. Not yet. At some point, Brittany drifted over and stood beside Grant. Not beside me, beside him. She looked up at him with an expression I recognized, the same admiration she used to aim at me. Then Grant said the thing that changed everything. He was talking about leadership, about what separates the people who run things from the people who just follow orders. He turned to me with a condescending smile and said, "No offense, Jack, but some people are just built to lead. Others are better suited to support roles. Nothing wrong with being a good employee." Before I could respond, Brittany laughed. Not a polite laugh, a real one, like he'd said something both funny and true. Then she said it. "Grant's a real leader. Jack's just an employee, but he's reliable, like a golden retriever." The group laughed. I stood there for a moment, letting it settle, watching my girlfriend of 3 years compare me to a dog in front of the man she was sleeping with. Then I smiled, excused myself, found Warren, and told him things were about to change. That night, I went home and slept surprisingly well. The next morning, I called Warren and told him to schedule a full board review for the following week. I wanted a complete audit of Grant's department. Performance metrics, expense reports, client satisfaction surveys, everything. Then I called my attorney. Grant's employment contract had a standard morality clause. It prohibited relationships with subordinates without HR disclosure, conduct that damaged the company's image, and conflicts of interest. Grant had violated all 3. Brittany's situation was more complicated. She wasn't technically Grant's subordinate, different department, but she'd signed an employment agreement when she was hired, one that included a clause about misrepresenting any personal relationships with management that could create a conflict of interest. When she was onboarded, she'd been asked directly whether she had any personal relationships with current employees or management. She'd said no. She was dating the owner. That was a material misrepresentation, grounds for termination. I spent the next 2 weeks building the case. Security logs, expense reports showing Grant had been charging intimate dinners to his corporate card and labeling them as client entertainment. Upscale Italian places, steakhouses, a trendy sushi spot downtown. None of those client contacts existed in our system. He'd been funding his affair with my money for months. Then there were the email patterns. Nothing explicit, but messages sent late at night. Inside jokes that had no context in a professional relationship. Informal language you don't use with a colleague you're not sleeping with. The performance reviews sealed it. Brittany had received a 7% raise 6 months ago, despite a meets expectations rating, not exceeds. Then another 5% raise 3 months after that, both approved by Grant. He'd been manipulating the system to benefit the woman he was seeing. Classic abuse of authority. The board meeting was me, Warren, and our corporate counsel. We reviewed everything and reached a unanimous decision. Grant was terminated for cause. Multiple contract violations, abuse of corporate resources, failure to disclose a conflict of interest. Brittany was terminated for cause, material misrepresentation during the hiring process, and acceptance of benefits derived from an undisclosed improper relationship. I signed both termination letters personally, but I didn't execute them right away. I had one more thing planned. The following Thursday, Warren arranged a working lunch with the regional directors. Standard strategy session. Grant was expected to attend. At 11:45 that morning, Grant and Brittany left the building together. Security cameras caught them getting into his car. They drove to an Italian restaurant about 15 minutes away, a nice place, the kind where they probably figured nobody from work would see them. They were right. Nobody from work saw them. I did. I arrived at noon, walked in, spotted them at a corner table, and sat down across from them. The look on their faces is something I'll remember for a long time. Grant went white. His fork stopped halfway to his mouth. His jaw dropped like something out of a cartoon. Brittany's fork clattered against her plate loud enough to make nearby tables turn and look. Her hand was shaking. I introduced myself. My real name, my real title. Owner and CEO of Apex Facilities Management. The silence lasted about 30 seconds. It felt longer. Grant recovered first. He started stumbling over explanations. This was all a misunderstanding. He never would have acted this way if he'd known. He and Brittany were in love. It wasn't what it looked like. I raised my hand and stopped him. I told him I'd already seen the security logs, the expense reports, the emails. I knew exactly what had been happening and for how long. Then I pulled out the termination letters, both already signed. I handed Grant his first, watched him read it, watched the color drain from his face as he realized his time at Apex was over, and that a for-cause termination would follow him to every future reference check. Then I handed Brittany hers. She stared at it, then at me, then back at the letter. When she finally found her voice, she asked how I could do this. She'd trusted me. I'd lied to her about who I was. I let that sit in the air for a moment. Then I reminded her that she'd been sleeping with another man for at least 6 months, that she'd laughed at me in front of my own employees, that she'd called me an employee and compared me to a dog. I showed her the security log screenshots, her card, his card, the timestamps, the same pattern repeated over 4 months. Then I pulled up the expense reports, all those romantic dinners, all those charges filed as client entertainment, all the dates matching their after-hours access. I asked if she still wanted to talk about trust and honesty. She started crying. Grant tried to intervene and threatened to sue for wrongful termination. I told him his termination was fully justified under his contract's morality clause, that I had documented evidence of expense fraud and abuse of authority, and that if he wanted to litigate, my legal team would happily countersue for the corporate funds he'd misappropriated. His attorney could contact mine. He went quiet after that. I stood up, left enough cash on the table to cover their lunch, and walked out. That evening, Brittany came back to pack her things. I'd changed the locks, but let her in to collect her belongings. I stood in the living room and watched her fill boxes while she cried and yelled and cycled between apologizing and blaming me for everything. It was almost predictable. First, she'd cry and say she was sorry. Then she'd get angry and say it was all my fault for lying about who I was. Then back to crying, then back to anger. At one point, she threw a picture frame across the room. It was a photo from our first anniversary trip. The glass shattered against the wall. I didn't react, just stood there with my arms crossed. She demanded to know why I hadn't told her who I was from the beginning. I told her the truth. I'd wanted to see who she really was when she thought I had nothing to offer. Now I knew. She called me cold, calculating, manipulative. I told her she was describing herself. She threw a coffee mug. It shattered and left a brown stain on the paint. Around midnight, she ran out of things to yell about and things to throw. She just stood in the middle of the living room, surrounded by boxes and broken glass, looking lost. For a second, I almost felt something like pity. Almost. Then I remembered the expression on her face when she called me a golden retriever. I spent the next hour sweeping up glass and scrubbing coffee off the wall. Then I poured a glass of water, sat on the couch, and turned on the TV. Slept fine that night.
Here's where it gets interesting. Brittany's car, the nice Honda Accord she'd been driving for the past 2 years. She thought it was hers. Her name was on the registration, she made the monthly payments, but the loan was in my name. We'd gotten the car together about 18 months earlier. Her credit wasn't great, so I'd co-signed to help her get a better rate. I made myself the primary borrower and her the co-signer. The title was in her name, but the debt was mine. 2 days after she moved out, she stopped making payments. The bank notified me. As the primary borrower, I had the right to take possession of the vehicle to protect my credit, especially since the co-signer had abandoned the loan. I had the car towed from her sister's driveway on a Saturday morning. 7 a.m. I was there to make sure everything went smoothly. Brittany's sister ran out in her bathrobe, screaming at the tow driver, threatening to call the police. The driver handed her the repossession paperwork and explained that the primary borrower had the legal right to recover the vehicle when payments weren't being made. She was welcome to call whoever she wanted, but the car was leaving. 20 minutes later, my phone started going off. Brittany screaming that I'd stolen her car. I told her to go ahead and call the police. They'd explain that a primary borrower recovering a vehicle to protect their credit interest isn't theft. It's completely legal. She called me every name in the book, said I was petty, vindictive, that I'd regret this. I told her I already regretted a lot of things about our relationship. This wasn't going to be one of them. I sold the car 3 weeks later and got a fair price from a dealership. The proceeds covered the loan payoff with a few thousand left over. That money ended up becoming relevant later. About a week after she moved out, the social media posts started. First, vague. Something about toxic men who can't handle rejection, about companies that let personal grudges affect professional decisions. Her friends flooded the comments with support. How strong she was, how she deserved better, how karma would sort things out. Then it got specific. She named Apex Facilities Management directly, said she'd been fired without just cause, said the owner had a personal vendetta against her, said she was consulting with an attorney about wrongful termination. She didn't name me by name, but anyone who knew both of us could connect the dots. The posts got some traction. Sympathetic comments, shares. Someone even left a 1-star review on our company page saying they'd never hire a business that treated employees this way. My attorney sent a cease and desist 2 weeks after the first post. It laid out clearly that her statements were defamatory, that she'd made demonstrably false claims about the reasons for her termination, and that she'd signed a separation agreement acknowledging the termination was for cause. Continued false statements would result in legal action. She didn't stop. We filed a defamation lawsuit 3 weeks later. 32 pages. Every false statement documented, screenshots, timestamps, engagement metrics showing how far the misinformation had spread, named specific damages, included her termination documentation, the signed separation agreement, the evidence of misconduct, everything that proved her public statements weren't just opinions, they were demonstrably false statements of fact. She was served at her sister's house on a Tuesday morning. Apparently, she refused to open the door. Her sister eventually accepted the papers on her behalf. She thought I was bluffing. I don't bluff. Her social media went quiet for about a week. Then she posted something vague about being silenced by powerful people who couldn't handle the truth. Got a wave of supportive comments. Then deleted that too, probably on her attorney's advice. Her attorney contacted mine wanting to discuss a resolution. They offered a public apology and deletion of all posts in exchange for dropping the suit. I told my attorney to decline. I wanted monetary damages. I wanted legal costs covered. And most importantly, I wanted it on the record that she had lied. The case was in progress when something else wrapped up. The defamation case settled about 6 weeks later after 3 rounds of negotiation. Their first offer, a private apology, no financial component, rejected immediately. Second offer, $5,000 in damages, still well below what we were seeking. Rejected again. Her attorney called the next day and said his client was running out of resources and couldn't afford to take this to trial. We settled at $15,000 in damages plus my legal fees.
She also had to sign a comprehensive non-disparagement agreement covering any public statements about me, Apex, or the circumstances of her termination. Violation would put her back in court facing breach of contract on top of the original defamation claims.
The most important piece was the written declaration, a notarized, sworn statement admitting that her social media posts contained false information about the circumstances of her termination, that she had been let go for cause based on documented misconduct, and that her claims of wrongful termination and personal vendetta were inaccurate. That document now exists as a permanent legal record. If she ever tries to rewrite the narrative with a future employer, a future partner, anyone, there's a paper trail that follows her. The money from the car sale, combined with the settlement, covered every dollar of my legal expenses, with a few thousand left over. I donated the remainder to a local nonprofit that helps people rebuild after tough situations. As for Grant, I heard through industry contacts that he'd been struggling to find work. When you're terminated for cause from a management position, and the termination letter specifically cites expense fraud and inappropriate workplace conduct, word travels. The facilities management world isn't that big. People talk at conferences, compare notes on candidates, make calls when someone applies with a termination on their record. Grant applied to 3 of our competitors within the first month. All 3 called Warren for a reference. Warren told them the truth. Terminated for cause, documented issues with expense reports, an undisclosed improper relationship with a colleague. The facts were enough. All 3 passed on Grant. He tried smaller regional companies next. Warren got more calls. Same answers. Grant became radioactive. Last I heard, he'd moved into retail management, assistant manager at a big box store, earning probably 1/3 of what he'd made at Apex, a significant step down from regional director. Brittany moved back in with her parents after her sister apparently got tired of the stress and the constant drama. She's been doing temp work, administrative stuff mostly, nothing permanent. We haven't spoken since the settlement was signed. I don't expect we will. As for me, things are good. The company had its best quarter ever. We're expanding into Michigan. A woman named Patricia, who actually knows what she's doing, is managing the Kentucky territory that Grant was supposed to develop. Warren announced he's thinking about retiring in a couple of years. He's been running operations since my father's time. We're already talking about succession planning. I may actually need to become more visible at the main office after all. And I started seeing someone new. Her name is Monica. She's a CPA with her own career, her own money, her own life. On our second date, I told her I own Apex, showed her the corporate records and everything. She said, "Oh, that's cool. Do you want to split the check or should I grab it?" I think I'm going to like her. 6 months later, I was at the annual industry conference in Columbus. About 500 people from companies across the Midwest. The usual mix of networking, vendor exhibitions, and panel discussions about regulatory changes. I was at the coffee station during a lunch break when someone tapped my shoulder. Grant. He looked different. The expensive suit was gone, replaced by something off-brand that didn't quite fit. No designer watch. The confident arrogance had deflated into something closer to nervous energy. For a second, I considered just walking away, but he wasn't being aggressive. He was just standing there with an uncertain expression, waiting to see if I'd give him 30 seconds. I gave him 5 minutes. We found a quiet corner near an emergency exit. Grant apologized, and not the defensive, excuse-filled version I'd heard in the restaurant. This was different. He said he'd been arrogant and stupid, that he'd convinced himself the rules didn't apply to him, that losing everything had forced him to take a hard look at himself. He talked about the past 6 months, the job rejections, the financial stress, the humiliation of going from regional director to retail assistant manager, the slow realization that he'd thrown away everything he'd worked for because he thought he was too smart to get caught. He wasn't asking for his job back. He wasn't asking for forgiveness. He just wanted me to know he understood now, that the consequences had been fair. He shook my hand and left. Later that evening at the conference reception, I ran into Richard, the CEO of one of our competitors. We've known each other casually for years. We compete for some of the same contracts, but it's always cordial. Richard mentioned that Grant had applied at his company a few months back.
said the resume was impressive, but the termination gave him pause, so he'd made some calls. Then he told me something that caught me off guard. He'd recently heard that Grant had been volunteering at a nonprofit that helps formerly incarcerated people find employment, that Grant had started mentoring young men trying to rebuild their lives after making bad choices. Richard thought that said something about character, about growth. He asked if I had any objection to giving Grant a second chance. I thought about it for a moment. Then I told Richard the truth, that Grant had made serious mistakes at my company, that those mistakes had consequences, but that I wasn't in the business of holding grudges forever. If Richard wanted to give him a shot, I wouldn't stand in the way. Richard thanked me and went back to working the room. Brittany still hasn't apologized. She keeps posting vague, passive-aggressive things on social media that are obviously about me without naming me. Something last month about narcissists who destroy people's lives. Something the week before about surviving toxic relationships with men who have too much power. Her sister blocked me months ago, which I find genuinely funny since I never followed her in the first place. Monica and I are still together. Things are going really well. She met my mother last month. We're talking about moving in together this spring. She doesn't care about the company or the money. She just likes spending time together. The company just landed our biggest contract to date, a hospital system with facilities in 3 states. Patricia is handling the rollout. She's doing better than Grant ever did.